Hello, friends. Welcome to Empty Cup Monastery. I'm Maya Soma, and I'm here with Bhakti Sudhason. And tonight we'll have a Sangha Roundtable, which is one of our series where we do some impromptu discussions on suttas that we select 2 minutes beforehand. And we'll start. I'll invite Bhante Sudhaza to guide us in meditation before we start. And the topic will be likes and dislikes. So we can start by contemplating our likes and dislikes in meditation and then about it. All right. Thank you, Bhante.
You can start by getting in a meditation posture. So sitting up straight, with your hands resting gently in your lap. Close your eyes. And take a few long, deep breaths. Just letting your body and mind relax with each breath. Bringing a little smile to your lips. Just fully enjoying being here in the present moment with nothing you need to do, nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to plan. You can just relax into presence, a joyful, peaceful presence here and now. And centering attention in your body. So clearly feeling the sensation of your body. This warm, solid, physical anchor for attention. So with a relaxed, happy mind, focus attention on clearly feeling your whole body as a single solid object. And whatever sensations there are, be clearly aware of them as they come and go, without liking or disliking any particular sensation, without trying to hold on to any sensation, without trying to get rid of any sensation. So whatever sensation comes, we fully accept it without attachment. just knowing and letting go. So whether the body feels hot or cold, painful or pleasant, light or heavy, we just let those sensations flow through the mind, clearly aware without either approving or rejecting, just peacefully knowing. You can adjust your posture. Do a little bit of stretching if you need to.
Right. Thank you, Bhante, for guiding us in meditation. And hello to the friends who have tuned in. Kumu, Janaki, Mary, Jayanta, Maranta, Tara, good to see you. Julie, John, Patricia, Rick, and Roman, who are checking in. And welcome to everyone else, as well as, of course, our residents here at Empty Cloud, always. And so this evening, we will be reading from Samyutta Nikaya 35.94, which you should all have a link to. And the translation that we will be reading from is from Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. And I will read, Bhante, Sudhasan, and I will share some reflections, and you're also invited to type in any comments and questions that you might have as we go through, and we'll address them as we go. All right, but first and foremost, we can start by paying homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, the reason why we're all gathered here tonight. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Uttam dhammam sangham namassami. So the sutta begins. Atsavati. Bhikkhus, these 6 bases for contact, if untamed, unguarded, unprotected, unrestrained, are bringers of suffering. What 6? The eye, bhikkhus, as a base for contact, if untamed, unguarded, unprotected, unrestrained, is a bringer of suffering. The ear, as a base for contact, the mind, as a base for contact, is bringer for suffering. Well, I think they
Sort of
dot.
So eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind.
Thank you, Bhante. The 6 bases for contact, if untamed, unguarded, unprotected, unrestrained, are bringers of suffering. Would you like to share some reflections, Bhante?
Yeah, well, just first off, pointing out here that this is the 6 ayatana, the 6 sense domains, which is one of the ways that the Buddha divides up our experience. So this is meant to be a complete picture. Everything we experience fits into one of these 6 domains. So eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. The 6 ways that we experience reality. And the Buddha here is introducing the idea of sense restraint. So he doesn't use the term sense restraint in this discourse, but he does say, if one is not, hasn't tamed, guarded, protected, and restrained one's eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, then one's sensory experiences will bring suffering. So that's basically the message that he's bringing forward here.
Thank you, Bhante, for clarifying. And the sutta continues. Bhikkhus, these 6 bases for contact, if well tamed, well guarded, well protected, well restrained, are bringers of happiness. What 6? The eye, bhikkhus, as a base for contact, and all the way through the 6 senses, is a bringer of happiness. These 6 bases for contact, if well tamed, well guarded, well protected, well restrained, are bringers of happiness. So I particularly like actually these introductory verses of this sutta, because usually, there's this common misconception in Buddhism where people say life is suffering or everything is suffering, as opposed to there is suffering. And so here it's pointed out, literally that, our experience is more what we're doing with our experience, what we're doing with the senses, rather than the senses themselves. The senses are just the senses. And it's usually because they are untamed, unguarded, and unprotected and unrestrained, then they create conditions for suffering to arise in the mind. But as we start learning the teachings of the Buddha and practicing the teachings of the Buddha, then we are empowered to start learning how to tame and guard and protect and restrain the senses. And then they bring happiness. Isn't that wonderful? So this is what comes to mind to me. And I really quite love how the Buddha talks about it so clearly, so succinctly in just a few verses.
Yeah, so just talking a bit about these 4 adjectives he uses. So tamed, guarded, protected, and restrained. Actually, the first one, tamed, I find this quite evocative because what comes to mind for me was a few years ago, I was visiting a certain temple, and there was a cat, and it seemed like a friendly enough cat, so I went to pick it up. And I still remember this experience because it came as quite a surprise to me. I picked up the cat, and the first thing the cat did was it let out a meow, and then it sank its claws into my forehead and its teeth into my cheek, which came as quite a shock to me. So I put the cat down, naturally. Um, and just thinking about how different that is from, for example, the cat who lives here, who's extremely friendly and peaceful, and you can pick him up and he's not going to sink his claws and teeth into your face. So what's the difference? The difference is that the cat here is extremely well tamed. So he understands the importance of being gentle, of being restrained. Whereas a cat that's more wild is more likely to be harmful. It's more likely to lash out or attack. So it's the same with our senses. If we relate to our mind as if our mind was a logical, rational being, then disaster will ensue because realistically, that's not what our mind is. Our mind is a wild animal. Our mind is a wild animal that keeps lashing out and reacting irrationally, even violently, to situations, and that brings suffering, it brings pain, it brings misery and anguish. But if the mind is well tamed, then it's like having a really friendly, cuddly cat that comes and sits in your lap and you meditate, like a resident cat who seems to spend most of his time sitting on Andrew's lap these days. So one of our residents here right now. Yeah, well guarded, well protected, well guarded and protected from the arising of defilements. So normally we use our senses as a way of pursuing pleasure. And when we see something pleasant, we immediately latch onto it. Or when we see something unpleasant, we immediately hate it. So this is when we're not guarding and protecting our senses. We just jump directly into reaction. So reacting with desire or aversion to everything that we experience. Which is why in Buddhist practice, we're trying to cultivate non-reactivity. So equanimity of mind, the mind which knows sensory experience but doesn't react, but rather knows the experience and discerns when there's a proper moment to respond appropriately, which is very different from the blind automatic reactions that we tend to engage in. Any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Bronte. Well, what comes to mind is actually, well, the translation invitation that you gave us a while back on Upeka, so the literal translation of equanimity from Pali, which means looking closely. And so when we look closely at something, we fully understand it, and hence there is no sort of basically the conditions for reactivity not to happen in the first place, because we see it, we understand it, and we can be with it as it is. So what comes to mind is sometimes the the confusion that can be in when one first starts practicing, or even after a while practicing. So the confusion that can arise in the mind with thinking that equanimity means indifference or not caring, whether there is whether one is kind of being served amazing Thai food or feces, no? Yeah, so we tend to think like, oh, okay, well, if someone is equanimous, the Buddha would not, care or like not really distinguish one from the other. But in reality, I can't remember which sutta in particular, the name of the sutta, but I remember when I first read it, I was actually so mesmerized. The description of how the Buddha tastes this actually delicious food that is served to him. And it's not that he's like, oh, whatever. He actually can taste every single part of it, but without attachment. So fully being present, understanding like the quality, the textures, etc., but not grasping, not clinging to it, and fully understand what the experience is. And it's actually quite beautiful, actually, the whole description also of how gracefully he eats and how composed he eats. And it's actually like such a beautiful read in and of itself, that is quite inspiring. Instead, when we think in terms of how we approach, for example, food, and there is a mind of greed, instead is quite the opposite of dignified. It's usually like very fast, and like maybe stuff starts dripping all over, and our anagarika here, Jens, he's wearing white clothes, so if we're wearing white clothes, then all the stains are very like visible. So we can't hide our defilements. They're all right there, present. So it's the opposite of how essentially the Buddha is experiencing that, but also out of hatred of something. We're also like, our face is not really beautiful to look at either. So anyway, this is kind of a bit of stream of consciousness that comes from what you just shared. So maybe.
Yeah, again, just emphasizing that sense restraint, it doesn't mean ignoring our experience. Quite the opposite. It actually means being fully aware of our experience, so that we can be present without reacting. So sense restraint means restraining the mind from its automatic reactions. It doesn't mean ignoring what you see or ignoring what you hear. Because actually, if you ignore your sensory experiences, then your defilements will just keep operating in the background, and you won't have any opportunity to learn how to control them.
Yeah, thank you for specifying that, Tim. So we can continue, and the sutta goes, this is what the Blessed One said. Having said this, the Fortunate One, the teacher, further said this. Just 6 bhikkhus are the basis for contact, where one unrestrained meets with suffering. Those who know how to restrain them dwell uncorrupted with faith, their partner. Would you like to share some reflections? There's a full poem now, so there's going to be.
Let's keep going with the poem, and then we can come back and say a bit more.
Having seen forms that delight the mind, and having seen those that give no delight, dispel the path of lust towards the delightful, and do not soil the mind by thinking, the other is displeasing to me. Should I keep going?
Yeah, keep going.
Having heard sounds both pleasant and raucous, do not be enthralled with pleasant sound. Dispel the course of hate towards the raucous, and do not soil the mind by thinking, this one is displeasing to me. Having smelled the fragrant, delightful scent, and having smelled a putrid stench, dispel aversion towards the stench, and do not yield to desire for the lovely. Having enjoyed the sweet, delicious taste, and having sometimes tasted what is bitter, do not greedily enjoy the sweet taste. Do not feel aversion towards the bitter. when touched by pleasant contact, to not be enthralled. Do not tremble when touched by pain. Look evenly on both the pleasant and painful, not drawn or repelled by anything. When common people of proliferated perception perceive and proliferate, they become engaged. Having dispelled every mind state bound to the home life, one travels on the road of renunciation. When the mind is thus well developed in six, if touched, one's mind never flutters anywhere. Having vanquished both lust and hate, obicus go to the far shore beyond birth and death. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Yeah, what comes to mind is actually also what the Buddha says in other places throughout the suttas, encouraging us to reflect. When we feel a pleasant feeling, we feel it attached. When we feel an unpleasant feeling, we feel it attached. And when we feel pleasant and unpleasant feeling, we feel it attached. And essentially, the Buddha teaches us how to instead take a step backwards, not backwards, forward, hopefully. Step. Now that I spent 2 months in Italy, I can't speak English anymore.
Take a step back.
Step back. Thank you. I put a words extra to the back. Yeah, and once again, fully understand our experience.
Yes, also I find notable here, again, towards the beginning, the Buddha says that one who knows how to restrain one's senses dwells uncorrupted with faith their partner. So pointing out how practicing sense restraint can be a basis for the arising of faith in the Buddha and the Dhamma, because it's something which seems counterintuitive at first. In fact, in non-Buddhist circles, it's very common for people to say things like, pursue whatever you love. If there's something you like doing, then give it your all. Like, people talk in these ways of like, oh, well, naturally, you should do everything you can to get pleasant experiences and avoid unpleasant experiences. But actually, that's how we keep ourselves constantly spinning in circles, always trying to chase pleasure and flee from pain. So sense restraint, this practice of being completely present with one's experience without reacting. It's something which is not commonly spoken about outside of Buddhist circles. But when one practices it, then one starts to discover a deep, unshakable joy, a joy which cannot be affected by our external experiences. And once one starts to touch that joy, which comes through practicing Dhamma, then one's faith in the Dhamma becomes very strong. So again, normally our sense of happiness is a conditional pleasure. I'm happy when I like the food. I'm unhappy when I don't like the food. I'm happy when it's warm. I'm unhappy when it's cold. I'm happy when I watch a movie. I'm unhappy when the movie is boring. Like, we have conditions. But through practicing sense restraint, we start to discover unconditional happiness, which has a sublime, peaceful joy. And once you start to touch that, then you have genuine faith in the Buddha's teachings.
Yeah, and it's because also it's so counterintuitive, right? I still remember when I first started practicing the teachings, there were some certain things that I was like, yeah, this is just not right. Like, how could it possibly be? I mean, I'm surely like much happier, having dinner, for example, than, it's a big deal. Actually, it was so funny. When I was in Italy, I was realizing that, in America, usually people, whenever they see me, they're like, oh, wow, you're a monastic. How can you be celibate? Wow, that's like really difficult. And in Italy, it's always, oh, yeah, okay, celibacy. Oh, yeah, okay. And then you don't eat dinner. Oh, whoa, okay, deal breaker. Throughout the peninsula, that was like the biggest deal. And funnily enough, that was my biggest deal too at the very beginning. And also, it was just so, sometimes we can get very lost in the sort of trivial. And I think that was a little bit my hang up at the very beginning, where it just didn't seem that much even rational to take a precept to abstain from eating afternoon, and to enjoy, company, quote unquote, enjoy the company of others. Usually dinner is like the biggest meal of the day. And as a lay person, I was like, hi, I don't know. It just sounds trading happiness for something that is kind of dukkha. Like, how is this the cessation of dukkha if it creates even more dukkha in the mind? And sometimes, actually, at the very beginning, when we take these precepts, there will be actually perhaps an increase of dukkha, paradoxically, which will create this shaking of faith. For example, I was, yeah, I remember having lots of Monte was there. He remembers how much I hated all the travada allowables. Anything that was in the allowable list, I did not want, and everything that was not on the list, I wanted. But paradoxically, there could have been like pizza, on the allowable list, and I would have like hated pizza because
I'm not so sure about that.
I think so, because it was actually like in the end, I kind of came into to term with the fact that it was not necessarily what was allowable or what was not allowable, but rather it was the fact that I couldn't decide for myself to take one thing, at the appropriate time or an inappropriate time, this time or this other time, or what is allowable or unallowable. And we are so trained, we train ourselves in this sort of apparent freedom, idea of freedom that brings us happiness, this worldly freedom that brings us happiness, when in reality, a lot of time is actually quite the opposite. It traps us into a lot of habits, a lot of pursuing of likes and dislikes. So most of our lay life, actually, most of our life outside of the monastery, is actually designed based on what we crave, so we keep pursuing it and staying away from what we dislike. So monastery setting and all these precepts that the Buddha gives us are actually incredibly compassionate tools, invitations to come and see for ourselves, like that we actually even have these hang-ups to begin with. And then we're like, oh, maybe actually, instead of creating a mind of craving, a mind of dukkha, a mind of jealousy, seeing other people that are, having dinner, enjoying their food while we are here in pain, because we also want to, experience whatever sensual pleasure they're having. Instead, we can cultivate the mind of mudita. We can cultivate, the Brahma Viharas in our minds. And so have the joy of missing out, but also the joy that rejoicing in the happiness of others. And that is much better, nicer place where to dwell. So we start seeing that then the more we take the teachings of the Buddha's working hypothesis rather than rejecting them, the more we see the truth of it. And then, of course, we start, becoming faithful. At least that was definitely, as the verse goes, that is definitely faith now is my partner. At the very beginning, I was borderline atheist, agnostic, the opposite of faith, of a faithful anything. So definitely not a faithful Buddhist. But the more you do this practice, the more you see it for yourself. That's why we talk about not blind faith in Buddhism, but rather the Dhamma invites us in to see for ourselves, and it becomes a lived experience, and we see the truth of these teachings for ourselves, and our minds start to become happier and happier.
Great, thank you. And I also wanted to talk a bit about, towards the end, the second to last stanza. So the translation says, when common people of proliferated perception perceive and proliferate, they become engaged. And I don't have the Pali text here.
I can take it.
But just to start talking a bit about this. So this is hinging on two words. Sanya and papancha. So sanya is commonly translated as perception or recognition or identification. And papancha is commonly translated as proliferation or complication. Okay, we have perfect. Yeah, papancha sanya. So papancha, again, is the process of complication or conceptualization. So sanya is when you first have a sensory experience and you form some idea about it. You put a label to it. You put a name to it. So that's the initial formation of some kind of concept around it. And then papancha is when you take that concept and you flesh it out and you make it complicated. So I usually translate papancha as complication. So it's when you take something which is inherently simple. So a sensory experience, inherently it's something very simple, like a physical sensation, or a taste sensation or a smell sensation. It's very simple. But then you put a name to it, a label to it, and that's already starting to complicate things. Then you start thinking and conceptualizing and rolling around stories and ideas in your head, in your mind. And that's the process of papancha. So this process of sanya papancha is how we take something simple and then make it into something very complicated. And also where we keep folding in a sense of self-identity. And so the Buddha says this is how one becomes engaged. And by engaged, he means completely locked in, like completely trapped in something. The Pali word actually literally is upayanti, which means getting closer. So you're like getting sucked into the experience, lost in the experience. So again, you start with a simple thing, like you have a taste sensation. It's very simple. But then you're like, well, this taste sensation, I'm going to call that cilantro. And then you start proliferating. You're like, oh, cilantro, I hate cilantro. I remember the first time I had it, I was 18 and I was having a burrito and I was like, gosh, this is disgusting. What did they put in this burrito? That's so disgusting. And then the mind just starts building stories and stories and stories. And the stories are all built around me and what I like and what I don't like and why it's the world's fault that I'm not happy. It's definitely somebody else's fault. Whoever put the cilantro in the burrito, they're definitely going to hell for that. So this is the process of papancha. And it's how we get completely trapped in our self-identity and our preferences. And self-identity and preference are a huge net of suffering. Yeah, they don't bring us happiness. In fact, they bring us the opposite. They just bring us this seemingly endless cycle of anguish. But it's when we can put all of that down and maintain complete non-reactive awareness, even while eating things like cilantro. I know advanced practice for some of us. So even while facing something which is really, really difficult for you, if you can maintain non-reactive awareness, then the mind starts to develop a sense of invincibility. And all of those stories which we normally fall into simply won't appear in the first place. Another really good sutta on this, by the way, is the Madhupindika Sutta, the discourse on the lump of honey, the honey ball sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya, which is all about sanya and papancha. So for further reading, check out that discourse.
Yeah, what also comes to mind actually, Bhante, is the sort of common, common examples that the Buddha is presenting here. So we tend to think that, at least I used to think that what was grounding me to samsara, or that was very difficult to let go, was, kind of major things, such as love and job and whatever, like great things. But in reality here, I love how the Buddha is kind of actually putting it a little bit sort of down to earth, in the sense that he's pointing out, actually, it's whenever you start obsessing about, a sip of like something that tastes good, or like some food that tastes good, like ordinary things in day-to-day life, like a tune that sounds nice, or a site that looks pretty. And I was in Italy actually. I just came back from Italy, where I come from, where they have refined all these sort of sensual pleasures. It is true, actually. That is the sort of, yeah, that's basically the kind of the nuts and bolts of it. And then the proliferation that we have on this, then that becomes love, and that becomes the sort of job and not. But literally, it's in the ordinary that we get attached. And so I'm thinking about the practices that we do, like in meditation, where we finally, for the first time, start shedding light on the processes, on these mind processes, on the way that we relate to every single experience, through all the six senses that we have in every moment. But prior to Buddhist practice, we're completely oblivious that we're even doing that, right? So you can't solve an issue that you don't even know exists, fundamentally. And yeah, and then I love how he says, having dispelled every mind state bound to the home life, one travels on the road of renunciation. So it's not necessarily this kind of, um, one day you are wasted in in the club or at the pub, and then the next day you're like a monk. Practicing a life of renunciation, and dwelling in nibbana, but rather it's a practice that, yeah, has to be done in a certain way, gradually.
Yeah, and just another bit from here towards the end that I find really evocative is in the last stanza, where the Buddha says, when one's mind is well developed in this way, so regarding these six sense domains, then one's mind never flutters anywhere. So the Pali word here is vikampati, which means to tremble, or to shake, or to waver. So the Buddha is saying that when one develops this mind of non-reactivity towards sensory experience, then your mind is always steady and stable. It can't be destabilized or disturbed by any experience whatsoever, no matter where you are or what happens. The mind is always unshakable, undisturbed, which actually is pointing to full awakening. So a fully awakened being is never shaken or disturbed or upset by any experience. So the Buddha here is also subtly pointing out the fact that sense restraint itself is a complete path to awakening.
Yeah, and why, in fact, one also takes the precepts, as a lay person, and there's a gradual. You start with 5, then you go to 8, 10, and then, as a monastic, you get more. You take more precepts. So how this practice, everything is so beautifully like designed by the Buddha in order to create the conditions for an unwavering mind. But we have some friends that are checking in and asking questions. Well, Wangmo, good to see you. Says, I really appreciate today's discussion. Thank you for tuning in, and hello to Gita. Sud says, dear Venerables, the joy peace one gets from listening to the Dhamma, like you stated just now, is that mudita? Well, I call it Dhamma Sukha, really. So maybe Bhante, do you have some reflections?
I mean, it's somewhat related to mudita, and that the word mudita literally means appreciation, by the way. But that's usually taken to mean appreciating the happiness and good fortune of sentient beings. Whereas again, the happiness that comes from Dhamma, it's called Dhamma Sukha, as Ayasoma was saying, and it's mentioned in a few places in the suttas. So the happiness or joy that comes from hearing Dhamma. So there's some relationship in that they're both happy states of mind, but they're not quite identical.
Thank you. And Satam, Satsitivili, I hope I am pronouncing your name properly, says, when I listen to the Buddhist teachings, it looks pessimistic. What is your idea about that? Absolutely the opposite. Actually, well, first of all, I find the teachings of the Buddha very optimistic, um, but first and foremost, realistic. So I think we have a wrong idea of what pessimistic or optimistic means. Usually we think of optimistic teachings that are actually not true. So we like sort of the bait, and sometimes we also willfully delude ourselves to think that certain things are going to make us happy, even though we've tried it over and over again and has not worked. But we like the sound of it, we like the idea of it, and so we tend to call those positive, like positive thinking or positive, like whatever, the hashtag. But in reality, actually, those, I would say, those are pretty pessimistic because they lead to more and more suffering. Also without getting even into spiritual traditions, the idea that the more you own, the happier you are. Well, actually, you open a newspaper and every day there's like actually pretty disgraceful things of wealthy people. The wealthier people get, usually then they start doing all sorts of bad deeds, all sorts of acts that are quite the opposite, that then coming from a happy mind, right? And that's because actually the more you get, the more you're a hungry ghost, basically. There is no end to greed. So there is no end to what you can obtain. If you have a little, then there's the idea that the more you pursue these things, then eventually you're going to get happy. But actually, once you have a lot, it's pretty clear that there's, that that's not it. But you keep on fooling yourself. So, yeah, I think that's pessimistic because it leads once again to suffering. So the Buddha's teachings are very much, yeah, related to how things are. So presenting the truth, the reality of things. And as we were, sharing, or actually as Buddha shares in the first two paragraphs, we see how perhaps the pessimistic side of the Buddhist teachings is presented in the first paragraph of how the six senses can be the grounds for suffering to ensue. But then it's right, the second thing he says is quite the opposite of how used, developed. If we develop the mind skillfully with a restrained mind, actually they can be instead the grounds for happiness. That is incredibly optimistic. Whoever says that in a way that actually leads to the cessation of suffering, that leads to a happy mind. So super thumbs up, I would say. No?
Yeah. Actually, I would say Buddhism is extraordinarily optimistic because it offers a path that leads to permanent, complete, unconditional happiness. I can't actually think of something more optimistic than that. Buddhism only seems pessimistic if you think that it's impossible to change your mind. If you think that your mind is permanent and fixed and unalterable, then yeah, of course it's pessimistic. But that's not what the Buddha taught. The Buddha taught that the mind is completely changeable. Every single aspect of the mind can be changed. Through training and practice, you can transform your mind. And you can transform your mind from a suffering mind to a perfectly, infinitely happy mind. That's about as optimistic as things could possibly get.
Yeah, also like more optimistic than Western psychology, for example. Western psychology usually tells us that, it's impossible. Actually, not usually. It tells us that it's impossible to have a mind that is completely deprived of greed, hatred, and delusion. Actually, yeah, if you have that aspiration, it's usually pathologized. So actually, the fact that the Buddha tells us that it's possible to eradicate any form of greed, hatred, and delusion from the mind, wow. that is breaking incredibly good news.
Yeah, also, Western psychology says that it's normal to be sad sometimes. It's normal to be depressed. It's normal to have um, grief and confusion. And the Buddha is quite clear that actually, no, you have the ability to transcend all of that. You don't need to be subject to sadness or confusion. It actually is possible to have a mind which is immune to all unpleasant conditions. So again, this is so far beyond optimistic. I can't I can't imagine how anyone could think Buddhism is pessimistic. The more you look at Buddhism, the more you see that the basic character of Buddhism is an extraordinary optimism. Okay, there's some other questions.
Yes, Carl says, you mentioned awakening in relation to the Buddha. Did the Buddha himself consider himself to be fully awakened? Or did he believe even at the end of his life that he had further to go? No, the Buddha was absolutely fully awakened, and he said so himself multiple times. Actually, at the very beginning, if someone is not born Buddhist and encounters these teachings, like it was my case, when you encounter certain suttas like the lion's roar, you can actually have the wrong view, like I did, that Buddha is arrogant, because he actually not only says he's fully awakened, but he says how like impeccable he is and how great he is and how over the top all his mental qualities are. And I remember I was about to like um, quit Buddhist Insights and leave. We had an entire retreat, actually, it was led by Bhaktisiddhasa, and it was all these suttas one after the other. And my mind there was so much bad karma from the past, I guess. Like it was full of defilements. I was so angry. Like, how is it possible? An enlightened being, would be so humble and wouldn't be arrogant and da 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 da. And then luckily, I guess some good vipaka, good karma from the past that I had done. I was like, all right, let me put this on the shelf and I'll get back to it later. Probably I don't understand it right now. And in fact, I did understand it after a year. I think I fully understood that sutta, or at least understood it better, which was that actually the reason why he made all these statements were as an act of compassion for us, precisely to answer questions like the ones that you are asking right now. And how does one know if one is, awakened or not? Well, I will share with you Bhante Gunaratana's answer to this. Like, does someone need to tell you if you are hungry? Well, I think we all know for ourselves, right? And how do we know? We just know. So yeah, that's a clear sign with any stage of awakening. One knows. It's no different than the feeling of like being hungry or the feeling of being tired. Like we know, nobody from the outside needs to confirm that for ourselves.
And Sensitively says, thanks for the answer, but it still is not clear to me. Maybe if you explain to us why you think Buddhism is pessimistic, then maybe we can clear it up for you. Because again, I really don't see it that way at all. So maybe if you explain, we can answer. But I don't see any other questions online. Are there any questions from the monastery residents about this discourse? Pretty clear, pretty straightforward. Yeah.
And Kumu says, I have seen how relaxed, peaceful, and happy the Sangha are, especially the Sangha who genuinely practice Buddha's teachings. I and Bhante are very good examples for us. You're very kind.
You should meet my preceptor.
Yes.
Yeah, my preceptor, Ajahn Pasano, he's far more impressive than I.
And I would say that I'm not exactly relaxed, peaceful, and happy, but I'm much more relaxed and much more peaceful and much happier than I was when I started. So yeah, hopefully at the end, well, not hopefully, I'm sure that we'll just keep going this way. And Andrew?
Yeah. When it comes to perception, Sanya, is it just like the actual concept of the thing, or does it have baked into it like a lot of the views that you've spawned in the past about that thing? So every time you continue to go back to that concept, somewhere it recalls all of that information you fed into the concept.
Yeah, so there's layers to sanya. So the most basic layer is when you have any sensation, then the mind immediately puts a basic label on it. But then the mind tends to get in this sanya loop from that initial sensation with the initial label. Then it's now moved from a physical object to a mental object. So now you have the mental object, which is the memory of whatever sensation you just had, and its attached label that you just put on it. Then that mental object, you then have a sanya related to that. And it starts to pull in memories and concepts and associations from the past and so on. And this is where things start snowballing and turning into papancha.
Yeah. So even like before you start thinking about it, you're a layer removed from the actual sensory data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is why we put a lot of emphasis in mindfulness practice of trying to get to the direct sensory experience itself. Because that's actually before even sanya occurs. So like in the Paticcasamuppada, the Buddha says, salayatana paccaya passo. So based on the 6 sense domains, there is sensory contact. Passa paccaya vedana. So in other words, sense contact occurs prior to the arising of vedana. So sense contact itself is not pleasant or painful. It's just sensation, that's all. And then, as you continue down the road, the mind starts to produce ideas and concepts about things. But none of that is inherent in the sensory experience itself. And through mindfulness practice, you can stay with the direct sensation without producing all of that mental storytelling.
And presumably mindfulness gets sharp enough to catch feeling as it arises from the sensation.
Right.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's pretty thorough. And Rick asks, can you share some practical experiences of how this relates to letting go of a lesser happiness for a greater happiness? For example, my depression was reduced by taking my dogs on a walk instead of sitting. Well, yeah. So that is actually what the Buddha talks about in terms of that gratification, the danger, and the escape. So usually the escape that we use, we look for in terms of whenever we're experiencing suffering is always within the realm of sensual pleasure. So depression is a state that is unpleasant. So then we look for something that gives us a sensory input, like taking the dogs out. And it works temporarily, but then it's impermanent and the depression comes back, right? So what we are doing with Buddhist practice is actually finding another escape, which is not within the realms of sensual pleasures, but it's the higher happiness that we're talking about. So it's at the very beginning, that's where we get into the faith sort of camp, right? And the working hypothesis. But I would say that perhaps right now, maybe, what you're cultivating is perhaps not the right part of the Noble Eightfold Path, because it's not meditation that leads us to the cessation of suffering, but the Noble Eightfold Path, of which meditation is just a part. So, I used to suffer from a lot of depression personally, actually, since I was a teenager up until I started Buddhist practice. And it was not only meditation, but rather the amount of incredible service I had to do from day one, starting Buddhist Insights. And so doing basically dana every day, I was catching up with all the, Asian Buddhists. And so it's actually quite remarkable. We have our friend Tongkam here. And, I don't think that Tongkam spends hours and hours, 8 hours of meditation every day, right? You don't go to meditation retreats every day, right? But he's here, he's taking some time off work. He actually is a very hard worker, but he's also a heavy hard worker in terms of dana and sila. And always joyful, always happy, coming here at the monastery whenever there's an opportunity for merit here and in other temples, because I follow him on Facebook. He's always like, I went to this temple, this other temple, in this country and other countries. Even when he doesn't go to the temple, there's always like, yeah, great opportunity for punya. And he came here and like he's meditating, he doesn't move, chants in a very delightful way, incredible practitioner. So we see that, there's a lot of work that has been done that has delighted the mind, that then, the cultivation of sati and samadhi is much easier. There's a fertile soil. So that's the invitation. I'm not saying that that necessarily is your case, but we have to understand for ourselves, what are we, what do we need to work on? Where do we need to focus in our practice? And sometimes from my personal experience, what I saw was that actually, I started to need to delight in giving. So as the Buddha says, giving is an ornament of mind. And once you start understanding that and delighting in the act, not going like, okay, well, it says dana that I have to do, okay, check in the list, but rather becoming this joyful experience. And I recommend hanging out a lot with people who are born in Buddhist countries, because they don't have the learning curve in that. So it's always joyful, it's always beautiful and happy, and you want to partake in it, right? Then the mind starts becoming a more pleasant place where to be. And then meditation practice doesn't necessarily even have to be, anapanasati, but it can be recollecting your own virtue, the good deeds that you've done. And you're like, wow, I'm actually such a great person. I've done all these acts of merit, and I don't kill, I don't steal, I don't, engage in sexual misconduct, I don't lie. Hopefully I also don't use intoxicants. But anyway, whatever one does, it becomes like nice place. So we create the opposite of the conditions, where we want to dwell in that mind. And of course, it doesn't happen overnight. So it's not a pill that we take, but rather it's like planting seeds, growing a garden. If I put a seed in the soil, I don't expect it the day after to have germinated already, and to then harvest tomatoes after 1 week. It takes the time that it takes, but we do the work and we see it, we grow, and then we'll have a really good ripe tomato that tastes really well, really tasty. So I hope that answered your question.
Great. And we have a question from John. He says, so how do we tame, guard, protect, and restrain the mind in relation to the six senses? Is it in the moment when we sense something, step back and observe the sense, but then let it go without judgment? Yeah, so whenever any sensation happens, which sensation is happening pretty much every waking moment, so you get infinite opportunities to practice this method. So whenever any sensation occurs, pay full attention to it without reacting either with trying to hold on to it or trying to get rid of it. So normally we react with one of these two ways. To any sensation, we either want to extend it to keep it longer, or we want to shorten it. We want to make it go away as soon as possible. So instead, just be totally okay. If it continues, no problem. If it goes away, no problem. If it gets stronger, no problem. If it gets weaker, no problem. If it changes, no problem. If it stays the same, no problem. So having this mind of no problem, but it's very important that that be accompanied by sharp, close attention. Otherwise, you'll slip into apathy and dullness, which is not Buddhism. So sharp, close attention with a mind of no problem. Then you can't go wrong.
Great. All right. I think that was the last question. So thank you, Bante. And Komu says, yes, Ajahn Pasanno is amazing. The spelling is 1 S and 2 N.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we're all great fans of Ajahn Pasanno, and we all have the incredible good karma that there's a lot of talks from Ajahn Pasanno online. So you can Google them also on our channel. We were delighted to have him visit Empty Cloud Monastery this past year. So yeah, you can find there, and also on the Abhayagiri YouTube channel and the other temple in Washington State.
Pacific Hermitage.
Pacific Hermitage. Yeah, Pacific Hermitage.
So just a reminder that we'll have our weekly monk chat tomorrow evening. So
no, it's Wednesday.
Sorry, Friday evening.
Friday evening.
Friday evening. Time is an illusion. And it got a little more illusory than usual for a moment there. So Friday evening. So please stockpile your off-topic questions and bring them for Friday evening monk chat.
Yes, and tomorrow morning, Bhante Sudato will be sharing a sutta study on the 7 factors of enlightenment. We see a resident here very happy about that. We're all very happy. And so you can tune in tomorrow at 8 a.m. And then tomorrow evening, we'll have another Sangha panel, Sangha discussion on another topic. Why do monks don't work? Even though actually we work a lot. Well, we don't earn a living, so we don't have a salary and we're poor. So
we work with no salary. This doesn't sound so great.
Or maybe it sounds great. Who knows? You will find out tomorrow on BNN. And then Friday morning, Bhante will be sharing some other words on the Dhammapada that he's been doing this series on the Dhammapada Friday morning. And then Friday evening, we'll have monk chat with possibly some other venerables that are visiting Empty Cloud Monastery here, if they are willing to join in. So we'll multiply here. And then next week, at a certain point, we'll start a series on the Trigatha. So looking forward to seeing you all again, and we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
May you all be well and happy, and may all good things come to you.